Hello there, and welcome to Weird Music on the Glumberger channel. Of course, the show where each and every week we dive into an album of sorts, generate the discussion about them, just talk about music, right? So, today's episode, of course, we're returning to the randomizer with another look at a suggested album. And so today's suggestion comes from Sybil Mise daughter, sorry if I mispronounced the name there, who on my post about sad, devastating albums suggested this very one as one of the saddest albums amongst a whole bunch of others. And so when this came up on the randomizer, I had no idea what I was in for, essentially. I actually forgot where it was sourced from in terms of the comments. But as soon as I sat down to listen to it and started the first track, I immediately felt myself getting pulled into this incredibly dark and harrowing landscape that the album was offering. And usually I listen to the album many times before writing my thoughts on the tracks themselves, but when it came to this one, that first listening experience became so overwhelming that I had to try my best to articulate my thoughts right there and then. So, yeah, the script for this is going to be a bit of a weird one, but we're going to see how it goes. So, today I present Mise en Abyme by Raison d'Etre. So of course, let's ask ourselves the question, who is Raison d'Etre? Well, Raison d'Etre is the moniker for one Peter Anderson, a project that indulges in dark ambient atmospheres utilising droning synthesizers, offset by industrial sounds, ecclesiastical hymns, I can't pronounce that word either, sorry, and even field recordings from time to time, all creating otherworldly soundscapes that feel full of existential terror. And having operated since the early 90s, it seems, Anderson's produced a wide range of releases under this very moniker, even expanding upon his own world building with re-releases of his earlier works, it seems, including new tracks and remastering them and such. And so, of course, today we're looking at the album Mise en Abyme, a 4-track album lasting just over an hour in length that all effortlessly flows from movement to movement. A truly dark and harrowing experience that places you in this very peculiar stasis of isolation right within the void itself, it feels. And when I first heard this album, I was just stunned by the entire experience, and it was really dragging up similar vibes to me that I got from other such dark, harrowing album experiences like The Infected Math by Those Who Walk Away, an album we did a very lengthy dive into that I find really difficult to hear. But even other albums like Wilderness of Mirror by Lawrence English, where it's very harsh, cold soundscapes. Albums that essentially place you into this peculiar state of existentialism where the concept isn't to relax and subdue like normal ambient music, but rather just take you on a dark and disturbing journey. And so, like mentioned, when it comes to talking about the tracks themselves, I've essentially started writing my thoughts as I listened to this album for the very first time. So I think these dives into the songs is going to be a little bit weird, because they're literally my first experiences of this very album. But let's do our best. Let's just discuss the tracks then, shall we? So Mise en Abyme opens up with Avysos, a 12.5-minute drone to introduce us to the album, of course. And opening up with sort of subtle low-end drones that echo throughout the incredibly vast open landscape in the dead of nighttime. We think we're in for a typical dark ambient experience, I feel. That is until you're introduced to the appearance of varying sounds that occupy the various channels within your headphones. And as it progresses, more and more introduce themselves, sounding like the shuffling of feet, the creaking and rattling of equipment, or even the incredibly anguished breathing of some sort of creature that you can't properly make out the form of, if that makes sense. And all of these little details, they're sort of backed up by those continuing low-end drones that all help create this incredibly immersive atmosphere that really embellishes in such a dark, macabre nature of being. There's such a coldness to this kind of music, though. It really chills you to the very core of your being, with the very disparate sounds themselves coming across as spectres attempting to reach out through the ether itself, trying to communicate itself to you. And it's very peculiar as it becomes so overwhelming, so intense and oddly visceral in its own right, it feels. Kind of reminding me of the moodiness of artists like Tim Hecker combined with the incredibly weighty melancholy prevalent in the likes of Raphael Anton Isarai. And there's something very harrowing about that. It feels like being lost within the own recesses of your dark thoughts, at times. The macabre nature clouding your vision and just enveloping you in this terrifying emptiness. It's a truly phenomenal way to open up this album, and it's one that fills me up with this unsettling dread for what's going to follow on from this. And so the next track, Infernos, picks up exactly where the first track left off, with an unsettling murmuring and tapping of something far, far away in the distance, struggling even to be heard, before you're suddenly given harsh ambient sounds that feel so menacing and threatening on this one. And this one begins really slowly, taking its time to introduce the ambient layers, and instead it places us in this incredibly peculiar existential place that feels like being trapped in your own body as it slowly begins to decay to nothingness, it feels. I find this one to be a really interesting track. It's just because, as listening to it, it raises a level of anxiety deep within me, as it all slowly progresses, of course, with each and every sudden occurrence of a sound just setting my heart going off at a terrific pace. And then the more it goes on, the more oddly disturbing this one becomes. It slowly becomes much more intense as it progresses. And I think what really helps establish, such a dark, menacing atmosphere in this one is that incredibly sparse thump of some kind of percussion, that's just reverberating with such a wonderful ambience each and every time it occurs. It's interesting because it feels like we're slowly building up to something terrifying. And then it occurs at roughly 6 minutes in, when you're suddenly bombarded with such an overload of varying sounds. The clattering and rattling of metal, the resisting grinding of surfaces pressed up against each other so harshly, the tapping of some surface, it just ends up becoming this persistent beat within the very composition, bringing with it such an uncomfortable level of anxiety. And as well, each and every time those drones come in, they still feel so empty and so cold, perfectly establishing the very world building of this very album. And it's interesting because there is such a level of fear that is established within your very being, it feels. You feel it rising with your heartbeat as an uncomfortable drone suddenly enters the scene, which occurs roughly 10 minutes into this one. It's here at this point, 10 minutes in, I find the track to be its probably most existentially powerful, It just creates such a dark, uncomfortable atmosphere, and it feels terrifying to be a part of and to be experiencing it all. And that drone, it becomes so persistent. It becomes, it just rings in your very head as the machinery continues to rattle and whine with its natural percussive beat. And something about the combination of it just leaves me feeling so tense that literally I just want to start biting my nails and tearing my own skin apart. It's weird because I genuinely cannot remember the last time I heard an album that made me feel this way. And the sheer fact that it is making me feel this is, something I find truly astounding and incredible to experience, even though the experience is so full of terror. there's a power to something that communicates itself like that to you, and I find that very power to be truly fascinating. The sheer fact that this music, produces this incredibly unusual feeling with me. It's incredibly difficult to explain, especially trying to write my thoughts as I'm literally experiencing it, or going to just go off script here, but as I was experiencing it. But sometimes emotions can be like that. They can just be incredibly confusing and tumultuous, but it's fascinating in a weird way. But my goodness, a terrifying track, but what an experience. From here we move on to track 3, Katharos, which is an incredibly unique experience on this album. And so immediately we're introduced to this, reverberating gong sound before you're given devotional songs singing from the very darkness itself. And I can't understand what's being sung here, but the sheer tone, the sheer note, the sheer emotion in that voice, there's something so sad and heavy about it, about what's being expressed, that it just leaves you feeling floored by the entire track before it's even barely begun, essentially. And the more it goes on, the more peculiar and weird it starts to feel, though, as though it's been caught in some kind of vaporwave vocal filter, it seems, before it then gets lost within the very layers of the dark ambience itself. And once it enters that ambient drone, you hear the rattles of some religious chime blowing in the wind, backed up by quiet, echoing vocal layers. And with this one, you feel just so densely immersed in pure sadness, it feels, with there being so much space in the song itself to just leave you with your thoughts, essentially, and just considering it all. And just when it feels like it might start to make some level of sense, you then get pulled into this incredibly unusual movement with the rattling of percussion and gongs and their sounds echoing into these incredibly ambient layers. And so, weirdly enough, hearing this part, I was reminded a lot of Irv Teobel's Environments 2, Tintinnabulation, I don't know how that's said, sorry, special low frequency version, which is an album I mentioned back in our second ever video of Weird Music, has no doubt a big influence on Earth 2 special low frequency version, but we might come to it in another video. But the album, Environments 2, Tintinnabulation, an album that utilised recordings of the gong, to create this incredibly unusual album experience, However, Raison d'Etre doesn't drag it out for an hour like Irv Teobel does, but rather uses it to sort of guide the track from movement to movement, letting those vocal layers come back in as haunting elegies to the damned, whilst momentarily you get this incredible rumble of ambience that stretches and morphs as it travels across the channels themselves. And I find this one really fascinating. The more it progresses, it's the more you start to hear these little inklings of sound in the various channels, Some right at the forefront, once again bringing us back to that menacing attitude of the previous tracks, whilst others feel completely lost within the background of it all, just trying desperately to communicate some message to anybody who can hear them. And it's the existential qualities of these tracks that really astounds me, I think. The combination of oddly disparate sound sources, all coming together perfectly on this track, and to be fair, the whole album itself, in the creation of something that really makes you feel just cold, empty, and hollow and stuff. And for me, hearing this kind of music, it gives me this sort of sense and feeling of having, passed over into the afterlife, and you're just now in an out-of-body state. And for me, listening to this part, watching as my very body is decaying into the dirt itself, as life just continues to occur all around me as I'm unable to interact with it no more. A peculiar image, but it's perhaps in the sheer darkness of the music is presenting is why such images are conjured up, such macabre, dark, grim images. Part of me genuinely finds it a bit oddly disturbing to be given such visceral images, but once again, part of me is fascinated by that fact, that music is able to make you feel that way and conjure up such images in your head. It's interesting, the occurrence of these particular sounds, creating this incredibly detailed macabre story. And so, of course, there's just one final track to close this one off. And after the experience of the previous 3 tracks and not knowing what's coming, I was left in a state of paranoia of how this album would close itself off. And you get roughly 16 minutes, Agraphos. And once again, this track flows in perfectly from the previous track, as all the tracks have done, to be fair. Ringing, you get this ringing that is, sort of submersed beneath these oddly gentle ambient layers that they're just droning away perfectly, to be fair. But once again, there's something ominous about it all, though. Something foreboding, as though there's an imminent danger lurking ahead, perhaps suggested by these incredibly subtle droning effects that are hidden within the very mix themselves. And you wonder what's going to reveal itself from the darkness, the more this one progresses, especially when you get the briefest occurrence of sounds that feel so faint, so formless within the very composition that you even wonder if you heard them at all. And it becomes very weird, especially as it moves on, as you get this very unusual droning effect that feels kind of like some sort of vocal effect, but it's one that's been so transformed by the horrifying existential experience of it all. Terrifyingly backed up by the gentle thumping of something just ringing away in its own natural reverberance. And it thuds with such an unusual presence, once again raising up those levels of anxiety and fear. And so weirdly for me, this one sort of conjures up a terrifying image of just the construction of some kind of coffin, hammering away the nails into the rotted wood that will hold our very bodies for all eternity before we're then given a haunting requiem by some formless being singing in a language that never existed, it seems. And so it feels like we've gone through a lot of harrowing emotions on this album, and as low as this album has dragged us on the previous tracks, there's something about this one that feels that we're about at the absolute lowest we can go. The voices bring with themselves such a haunting sense of melancholy, backed up by such a depressing ring of some church bell, once again far off in the distance, in the recesses of the darkness, somehow breaking through it all so we can at least hear it even faintly. And it leaves me feeling so incredibly sad and cold that all I could do was kind of sit there and just contemplate the very sounds I was hearing as I was dragged further and further into the darkness itself. And I think it's easily one of the darkest albums I think I've heard, something that chills me to my very core as I listen to it. And it's weird, but it's the kind of music that brings me back to those very times in life where the darkness had taken over, and all that's left is that sheer empty feeling of nothingness, like just a complete detachment to the world. It's really weird, and I'll try my best to explain it a bit, but I think that music like this is oddly comforting as a result. As when you're in those states, those who have been in those states and understand them, you feel so isolated, so alone, and so lost in the nothingness that you feel like nobody could ever understand. And music like this, it makes us feel as though somebody does understand. The fact that someone created something that is able to sort of parallel those experiences you've had in your life makes you feel so much less alone with them all. And it can weirdly enough give you such a odd sense of clarity and stuff, but it's also very painful and difficult to be dragged back to those places as well. It's very interesting. And so essentially with that, we've covered the 4 tracks, as was my first experience hearing this very album. I've written a bit more about it just to go into a bit more detail about stuff I discovered after the fact, but I just thought it was kind of interesting that the very first time I heard this one, I was experiencing such an existential experience essentially, and I really wanted to try capture that as best as I could, even though it was very difficult to comprehend it and put it into words almost. But simply put, it's a truly fascinating album, I feel. It's one that feels so incredibly dark and heavy, macabre, so cold and isolating, so depressing, and it pulls you along this fascinating journey that's so full of this really grim, dark imagery in your head. It's just so, just makes you feel like you're just slowly falling into the afterlife, that you're just decaying in, amongst the maggots and the dirt, it seems, and it's so peculiar. But the fact that it makes you experience something like that is truly fascinating, I feel. And so, I should say as well, a little further reading into this album, it reveals a lot of information that actually adds a lot of context and understanding for the dark and at times disturbing nature of this album experience. Like I said, when I first heard the album, I didn't actually read anything about it. I was just listening to it all, and then when I went back to sort of go through the Bandcamp and read what was written about the album, a lot of things started to make sense why I was feeling certain things and imagining certain things. So, let's just start at the beginning then. For starters, the title of Mise on Abyme is one whose etymology goes back to Western art history, with it roughly translating to placement in abyss. And so in art, it's a technique of sort of placing a copy of an image within itself, almost like recursion or the Drost effect perhaps. But I interpret Anderson's usage of this title to be a literal depiction of the very term, using the very soundscapes themselves to place us right in the middle of the abyss, right into the recesses of the darkness itself. And it makes sense when you consider the incredibly disturbing nature of the music, though, on this album, and how isolating it feels, how empty, hollow, and just full of sadness. And when you look at the Bandcamp liner notes as well, Anderson even goes as far as to explain the following. Mise on Abyme is an inner journey down to the most hidden and dark parts of the self. And so this is perhaps one of the most telling pieces of information. It makes so much more sense why the very experience of this album is one that feels incredibly personal for those listening to it, one that elicits such an existential response, that feels very isolating and depressing. And why, for me, when I was listening to it, I really imagined myself and all my feelings and stuff like that. I imagine, if you decide to listen, you'll have your own experience of it, perhaps. But it's very interesting that he describes it as a hidden, a journey down to the hidden dark parts of the self. Essentially, that it's that personal journey you end up experiencing. To go back to it though, another theme that's very prevalent on this album that's also mentioned in the liner notes is that of katabasis. And the term can be described as a descent into the underworld, which for Anderson was utilised by him by drawing themes and parallels with Dante's The Divine Comedy. The famous story of Dante, travelling through the afterlife, through hell, purgatory, heaven itself, the famous poems. I find it a little bit peculiar, but also interesting that, when I first heard the album and wrote down all the thoughts that you've just heard me very strangely try to present, I was getting so much imagery in my head of the afterlife and of death, decay, and a state of non-existence within that afterlife. And like I said, I hadn't read the liner notes when listening to the album for the first time, and so I found it very interesting that those very images that that were being conjured up was the kind of things Anderson was going for, thus suggesting to me that he's actually been able to perfectly express such notions within the very music itself. And I find it interesting just to go back to the Divine Comedy and the notion of katabasis, that Anderson simply hasn't just retold the story of the Divine Comedy through the music, but instead he's used it as a source of inspiration to create these soundscapes that just take you on your own personal journey into the underworld itself. It's truly fascinating to me. Yeah, goodness, genuinely floored by this album, I have to say. I find it difficult to summarize my thoughts and feelings on this one. I'll try my best though. So I'll say here, as mentioned, all my thoughts on the individual songs were from the very first experience listening to the album, and I think, as I was listening to it, I quickly realised that something, but I'm not sure what at the time, was communicating itself to me. It was just dragging me into the incredibly dark atmospheres that I just had to try to articulate that very experience as best as I could. I do apologise if it's come across as very rambly, but I just thought it was very interesting. But albums that can drag you into such dark feelings of depression and anxiety, it's incredibly weird because people may wonder, why would you want to experience something like that? But for me personally, I can think of so many albums that have communicated such things to me, and the many facets of those very emotions, across different experiences, if that makes sense. And I'm always amazed that, certain albums are able to perfectly express, rather concisely those complex emotions to me, and then, even at times can just leave you feeling in tears by the end of it all. I find it to be an incredibly powerful and unique thing, and maybe it won't have the same effect on everybody, of course. But hearing this one for the first time, it raised so many incredible, difficult emotions to me across that lengthy runtime. And miasma are some of the darkest facets of the human emotion, I would argue. It amazes me that Anderson was able to just create such a unique experience that can make people feel this way. And it's harrowing, it's terrifying, but in a weird way, there's something oddly beautiful about it as well. It's so difficult to properly explain. And so, I think with that, we're going to come to the end of our episode of Weird Music then. A huge thanks to Sybil Ashes-Madotta. Sorry for getting your name wrong, sorry for suggesting this one. Weird of me to, of course, draw some of the recommendations from the Sad Albums community post, or whatever I should call it, but I've always been fascinated by dark, harrowing albums, especially ones that perfectly communicate their emotions and ideals to me. And when I made that post, it was a particularly rough time in life, and I wanted, some salt on the wound albums to listen to. Mise on Abyme, though, just having pulled it up through the randomizer, though, it did just that, though, even after a couple of months, though, and it's fascinating because it brings you on such an incredibly disturbing journey, it feels, that leaves you so cold and isolated like the music itself. And it's a powerful thing, no doubt, and I'm truly appreciative of music that can make you feel that way and, once again, convey such dark, complex emotions. So, with that, I would like to thank you for watching today's episode of Weird Music, another one for the devastating albums playlist, I would say. Once again, hoping to get through more suggested albums, from all you wonderful viewers. We will see what the randomizer selects for us next time. It could literally be anything, it seems. But for now, I wish you all the best. Take care, and bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.